My name is Tracie Gilbert. I am very excited to be here speaking with you all, and I look forward to the time that we're going to have together over the next 90 minutes or so. Before I begin, I want to just acknowledge the communities that I represent when I speak in front of a group. I'm very clear that I'm not just an entity in and of myself. I stand on big shoulders, as well as in community with a wide range of colleagues and folks doing this work. And so I just want to lift up those folks at this time, as well as the people that I serve, particularly the young people, the babies that and the generations that will be coming up after we are long gone, attempting to make sense of, in some cases, the messes that we've made with society now. And so I just want to acknowledge the larger circle that is involved in this conversation as well. So just a little bit about me. You've had a chance, I'm sure, to read my bio. Just a little bit of information about me. I am a sexuality educator. I've been an educator now about 10 years. I just graduated, well, not just, maybe about 2 years ago, I got my PhD at the Widener University Center for Human Sexuality Studies. And I enter the conversation of sex ed through the lens of race. So I'm particularly interested in African-American sexuality, Black sexuality, which I'll get into today, as well as just sexuality and race more broadly. I also come to sex ed with a youth development background, so I'm very much interested in adolescent development and the ways that significant adults interact with young people on the topic of sexuality, as well as sexuality and faith. I do apologize. I did not expect this text to be this small, but my social media is below. I'm on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. If you would like to follow me there, please feel free to do so. I'm just going to quickly invite folks. I know there's a couple of folks who it seems to be chiming in via chat. I'm just going to ask you if you could please avoid that as much as possible unless there's a technical issue going on, just because it really allows me to be able to focus on what I'm talking about and not get distracted. There will be moments where I will invite you to speak and share and that will be welcome. But in the meantime, unless it's an emergency, if you could just please, or a technical issue, if you would just please hold off using the chat, that would really be helpful to help me focus. Okay, so as I'm sure you all are aware, we are going to be talking about race. And so just like sexuality, for any of you who have been teaching sex ed or working in sex ed classrooms, you know that we do try as much as possible to establish, we now tend to establish community agreements because we want there to be at least some chiming in from the group. In this case, we are gonna go with the old school traditional term of ground rules. However, I am going to go out on a limb and be brave and say that I trust that everyone will be able to follow suit and see themselves as being comfortable enough to uphold these. So I'll start at the top with the red arrow, which is a care for yourself. There will be discussions of things like sexual assault, as well as race and anti-Blackness, topics that can be very, very uncomfortable emotionally, particularly for those who've had those experiences. So as you need to, please care for yourself. Hopefully you're in a comfortable chair, you've got something to eat, or you've eaten already if you need to get water, whatever you need to do to care for yourself, please do so. I'm going to go, let's see, I guess I'll go clockwise and ask you to be open and honest, particularly if you hold a position of privilege with regard to this conversation. I'm going to encourage you to push yourself. One of my mentors in this field, Connie McCaffrey, uses the quote that a risk-free space is a learning-free space. And so I want to encourage you all to take risks and lean into the places that might feel uncomfortable for you, to figure out, is this genuine pain, or is this just something I need to get used to hearing, something I need to stretch myself and wrap my head around? The blue era, we probably will not use this as much during our conversation or during our time together today. But in the instance that we do begin our Q&A and folks have perspectives, I'd like you to offer amnesty. This is essentially recognizing the goodwill in everyone and recognizing that even the questions that we deem to be quote unquote stupid do come from places that in this conversation, we're going to suggest that they come from places that are genuine and that are well-meaning. Speak for yourself. Again, in terms of the conversation, it can be very easy to kind of project our own experiences onto others and onto what's happening in society. For example, you know, we might say, oh, well, you know, I don't have this issue or I don't see this issue. That means it's not an issue. I'm going to encourage you to focus on your own lived experience and recognize that just even if something has happened or not happened to you uniquely, does not mean that it is not an experience that is happening for other folks. And then last but not least, respect. That is self-explanatory. I'm going to encourage folks to please stay attentive as much as possible. I know screen fatigue is a real thing. However, at this point, we are all learning to adapt. And so please, as much as possible, stay attentive if you can, participate, show up to this space, and utilize the time because you could have been anywhere else in the world. So please take advantage and don't waste your own time by not respecting the space. All right, so we are going to jump right in and do an activity. I should specify this. This session there will be several things that occur in this session that may involve you writing some things down. So if you haven't already, I encourage you to grab a sheet of note paper next to you, or a journal or something that you use to write professional notes in, anything like that, or even just the sheet of scratch paper for this activity, or for this exercise or for this session. That would be great. So we're going to begin with a brainstorming activity. Hopefully you've gotten your sheet and your pen by now, or even just, you know, a note page in your phone is also fine. And what I'd like you to do, and we're going to spend maybe about 1 minute doing it, is think of the first 1 to 2 things that come to your mind when you think of sex and Black people. So again, this is brainstorming. You're not going to censor or filter what you're saying, what comes to your mind. Think of the first thing that comes to your mind when you think of sex and Black people. And we're taking a full minute to do that. Okay. And so what I'd like to do is to see, hopefully at this point you have at least one thing. I would like to see, I'm going to open up the chat and allow you to do this. I would like to see, just looking at what you wrote, how many folks, and so you can just really quickly put it, this point you can put it in the chat, put whether or not the thing that came up was stereotypical or negative, either negative or stereotypical, the thing that came up. So if you could, in the chat box, articulate yes or no, whether or not the thing that came up when you were thinking of Black folks and sexuality, whether it was stereotypical or negative. So we're seeing some folks who say yes, negative, stereotypical. We did get one no. Okay. We're getting a couple of no's, but we're getting quite a bit here. And I love to see those no's. the more I do this, and the longer I go and I see people writing no's, I'm like, okay, we're making progress. Amen. But if you've already had a chance to type in your response, if you can scroll through and kind of see the ratio. And thank you for acknowledging that you may not know, right? What are the ones that are stereotypical and what are the ones that are negative and what are the ones that are kind of like, okay, this isn't bad. And there may be some other folks who are chiming in. All right. Okay. There are some folks, I just realized there are some people who cannot see the comments. If you would make sure when you are responding that your piece says that you can respond to all panelists and attendees, because if you send it to all panelists, I'm the only person that can see that. But that's okay. That's okay. I will give you all the spoiler alerts and let you know that the vast majority said that it was negative, that they said they were negative or stereotypical. So in fact, what I'd like you to do now, I'm putting a poll everywhere. So I'm going to ask that people pause on their responses now so everyone can see what I just posted. There's a link there to a poll, and I'm going to ask you if you would be willing to share what some of the things are that you wrote down. And it is anonymous, so it won't be attributed to your name. But if you would start to write down some of the things that have come up, and I'm going to read some of them aloud. Oh, okay, hold on just a second. Okay. You should be able to access it now. I'm seeing folks come in. So we have beautiful, we have hypersexualization. I'm seeing HIV, experimentation, hot. Now that's interesting. Hot, that could be hot as in attractive or hot as in fast, or hot in my community, we called it hot in behind. So referring to hypersexualization. Seeing people talk about things like fetishizing, dirty. Black people are more sexual or aggressive. Sexual assault is their fault. Love. Kinky. Black love. Blanket statements. Promiscuous, fast. Fetishism. Mm-hmm. They aren't interested in learning how to have safer sex, right? So we can see that there's lots of different perspectives, and yet the vast majority of them come from a pathologized or pathologizing space or a stereotypical space. Yes. So again, yes, what was just put in the chat about sex being weaponized, being seen, folks being seen as sexually aggressive, et cetera, and so on. So we're going to move on, and you can feel free if you want to continue to put comments in the chat, in the, not the chat, I'm sorry, in the poll, but we're going to go ahead and move on. I just really wanted us to start here as a way to kind of frame where I'm getting ready to take us. So I want to offer this quote. This is such a weird looking picture, but to be honest, he was a weird looking man. So this is a picture of Michel Foucault, who is a sociologist, a sexologist theorist. And he was actually quoted in a book from Kelly Brown Douglas called The Sexuality and the Black Church, which is a book that I it was a game changer for me. I mean, I think there's been a lot of books that have come out since then that effectively discuss sexuality in the Black community. However, this is one that I know was an early one for me that I would strongly recommend anyone who is new to thinking about sexuality within African American communities to take a look at. And the specific quote of his that she includes is that there is no better way to impugn the character and humanity of a people than by maligning their sexuality. And I want us to start there, thinking about the quotes that, or the pieces that have just come up, as I think it is really an overarching way that if you want to think about what has happened and what has been experienced by the African American community at large, you can point to this quote as a good way to think about it. And so that brings us to our problem, which is the experience of anti-Blackness, both in society and in sexology, right? So we will get into a few pieces to talk about what anti-Blackness has looked like in our society, but I think it's also important to think about what this looks like in the field of sexology as well. And so generally speaking, we can point to the two experiences of limited knowledge of normative African-American experiences within sexology. So thinking about when we look at sex research and which populations get represented, far too often, Black folks are not included. Unless the second piece comes in, we're talking about them as a problem, right? So thinking about HIV prevention, thinking about stigma within the Black community related to homosexuality, when we're thinking about teen pregnancy, right? Anything that's coded as negative, that's where we can seem to find the vast majority of research on Black communities, but rarely to never do we find things that are just about the normative lived experience. And then by extension, that focus on the negative pieces implicitly and in some cases explicitly problematize Black sexuality in ways that are disproportionate to other groups. And so the three big kind of theoretical pieces that tie in together, let me turn off my other computer here so you don't hear those noises. The three theories that really kind of tie in together here are, and I'm going to go from right to left. So on the right, we have preventive versus eudaimonic sexual health discourse. This is from Linwood Lewis, who talks about the idea that in predominantly white communities, we can find that there's sex ed, that there is sexual health measures that are about enhancing wellness and recognizing sexuality as a normative part of the lived experience. Whereas in Black and brown communities, and in some cases, poor white communities, the overwhelming emphasis in sexual health is on prevention, right? So even regardless of the age, regardless of what the experience is, the idea is that it's advanced with the means to stop something from happening, namely Black sexual expression. In the middle, we have Kevin Magruder, who discusses, again, this attribution of Black sexuality as being non-normative. So because it doesn't represent white ideals, it is automatically assumed to be somehow non-normative and by extension abnormal, using whiteness as the reference point unfairly. The last one, though, which is really why we've come together, is this idea of anti-Blackness, which really kind of takes it really kind of undergirds, in my mind, the other two theories and really kind of takes the idea of racism, of disproportionate treatment of African-American people to a whole other level. And so before we move forward even further, I want to really quickly be clear to define what this means, right? And so how I define it in my work. And so the two particular definitions I use are one from João Castro Vargas, who discusses it as the sociopolitical, psychological organizing of Afro-descended people around via the narrative of death for the purpose of their physical and social emotional demise. And so I know that's a really kind of convoluted definition, but I want to also alert you all, I'm not going to read it here, but I want to direct you all in understanding this definition to the UN definition of genocide, because that's the foundation for which Vargas presents this particular idea. And if you look at that definition, and if you look at the specific pieces that that kind of articulate what it means to be practicing genocide against the people, you will find that African American people have experienced over the course of their history every single thing that's on that list. And so that's really what this larger kind of convoluted definition is referring to. At the same time, though, while we have these real-time physical things that are happening or that have happened to Black bodies themselves, we also observe anti-Blackness from Nicholas Brady as being a paradigmatic phenomenon. So it's not only just what's being done to Black bodies, it is also how Black bodies are being conceptualized, such that Blackness and death are automatically linked together. If you might have seen, if you've been on social media, if you were on social media during June when all of the uprisings happened around the death of George Floyd, well, even further earlier than that, when people were talking about the disproportionate effects of COVID in Black communities, and people were saying that anti-Blackness was the comorbidity. That is the example, right? The idea of Black folks automatically being linked to death and being linked in those intricate ways. Those are the two pieces that come together here to create the definition that I want us to chew on today. And so how are we going to chew on that? We are going to chew on that by looking at tangible examples of what this has looked like in our history, right? Because the thing about it, the beautiful yet terrible thing about it, is that we don't have to speculate about the ways that anti-Blackness has shown up in our history. We have countless examples of it very explicitly. And so what I'm going to do now is share with you just a touch of quotes that have been advanced by leaders in our country over the course of history for African people in the United States. And this is where we are going to open the chat and allow you to share affect. So as you are reading things, I would like you to share or feel comfortable sharing your affect. Again, we're just going to focus on affect. So please just share whatever emotion is coming up for you in the chat box as you hear each quote. So we are going to jump right in with the first one. So this is from James Madison, our 4th US president, who says that in being compelled to labor, not for himself, but for a master, in being vendible by one master to another master, and in being subject at all times to be restrained in his liberty and chastised in his body by the capricious will of another, the slave may appear to be degraded from the human rank and classed with those irrational animals which fall under the legal denomination of property. Right? So for those who are not understanding, again, because it's using a lot of big words, we have to remember that from their first kind of introduction to this country, African people were deemed to not be human right off the bat. So I want us to start there. From there, we move to this quote, which was actually used in the case of George, who was a slave who had raped another slave, who had raped a female slave. And this was the argument that was used in his defense in his case. And so this says, no white could ever rape a slave woman. The regulations of law as to the white race on the subject of sexual intercourse do not and cannot, for obvious reasons, apply to slaves. Their intercourse is promiscuous. Right? So this was the conceptualization of African women who were being raped at that time by both white and non-white folks. And I see all these chats. I'm going to assume and hope that that's affect. I'm going to come and look at it in a second, but I just want to make sure, hopefully, that is affect. So we know that rape was a common experience that occurred among African folks during their time in chattel slavery, right? We know that that not only there was the hypersexualization of African folks that justified them being raped, but we also know that rape was also about exerting power and establishing dominance over folks for being for being perceived as being too vocal, having too much of a sense of self-possession, right? So it was also about control as much as it was about sexual release and all of those things. In addition, though, we know that there was also the incentivization of pregnancy as well as breeding. And so this is actually a quote from Hilary Yellerday, who was one of the remaining folks who survived that system and was interviewed, I believe in the, I'm not going to lie and say I know which year, but I know she was a slave herself, and she talked about this experience. And she says, when a girl became a woman, she was required to go to a man and become a mother. Master would sometimes go and get a large, hale, hardy Negro man from some other plantation to go to his Negro woman. He would ask the other master to let his man come over to his place to go to his slave girls. A slave girl was expected to have children as soon as she became a woman. Some of them had children at the age of 12 and 13 years old. Negro men 6 feet tall went to some of these children. And so again, this was Hilary reporting her lived experience, what she saw in her slave community. All right, so I want to pause real quick before I move on, just to get a sense of what's going on in the chat and what's happening for you all affectively, just to name some of these. Pain, dumbfounded, guilt, nausea, fury, heart, thinking about, and I want to just, I resonate with that, right? Thinking about the young people that I work with, the 12 and 13-year-olds that I work with, right? And some of these challenges. Yes, trauma, anger, sadness, deep shame, dehumanizing, yes. So we don't have time to get into the full length of lived experiences that were happening with bodies. I just wanted to start us here so you can get an understanding of what was happening with bodies. But I want to move it on and talk now a little bit on the professional end, right? Thinking about the folks who were in this field that we now call sexology, right? So this is from Dr. Charles White, who was an English physician. And yes, we know England is not in the United States. However, we know there was a lot of crosstalk in the advancement of sexology from the United States and England. So I want to bring this piece in. So Dr. White says that the penis of an African is larger than that of a European, has, I believe, been shown in every anatomical school in London. Preparations of them are preserved in most anatomical museums, and I have one in mine. I have examined several living Negroes and found it invariably to be the case in simiae, which refers to, it's Latin for in comparison to apes. The penis is still longer in proportion to the size of their bodies. And so this was a scientific quote that Dr. White was advancing about Black bodies. Right. And so, no, it's not just a joke. It's not just a card you might hear in Cards from Humanity. This was actual pseudoscience that was advanced about about the nature of Black bodies. Right. If you are familiar with Saartjie Baartman, who was also referred to as the Hottentot Venus. Right. This was another example of hyper investment in hyper elevation of Black bodies, right, as being perceived as being abnormal, as being more than as being somehow abnormal compared to their white counterparts. And so this also relates to experiences that were happening on the ground, right? So I am going to actually kind of come back in and talk a little bit about body experiences, because I also, while we talk about race, I also want to acknowledge that lynching was a big phenomena that occurred as a result of infatuation with Black bodies. And so here is a quote that was shared from Thomas Nelson Page. And this quote actually comes from the book Race, I think I will give you all the book at the end. I cannot remember the exact name now. Gossett is the person who wrote it. But the quote from the book says, sometimes lynching was condoned or at least explained on the basis of the sexual nature of the Negro man. The intelligent Negro may understand what social equality truly means, says Thomas Nelson Page in 1904. But to the ignorant and brutal young Negro, it signifies but one thing: the opportunity to enjoy equally with white men the privilege of cohabitating with white women. Right? So there was a perception here, again, not only of hypersexualization, but also of colorism, of perceptions of beauty, right? And assumptions about not just Black sexuality, but also white female sexuality. And there was this idea that that intelligent Black men might be able to advance in society, but when it came to sex, they couldn't control themselves, because what they really wanted is to be in communion with white women. And this goes further. So the next quote that I'm looking at that I was talking about comes from Lester Ward, who was in fact a Darwinist, right? So he was the person who supported social Darwinism and this whole idea of survival of the fittest. And so I'm just going to read the highlighted, the italicized portion of this so you can see it. He says, the lower races, Ward maintained, experienced an unusual amount of sexual desire for members of the higher races because they dimly and instinctively realize that the improvement of their own race is involved. A Negro who rapes a white woman, Ward declared, is impelled by something more than mere lust. This is the same unheard but imperious voice of nature commanding him at the risk of lynch law, said Ward, to raise his race to a little higher level. Meanwhile, although the enraged citizens who pursue, capture, and lynch the offender do not know any more than their victim that they are impelled to do so by the biological law of race preservation, still it is this unconscious imperative, far more than the supposed sense of outraged decency, that impels them to the performance of a much greater and more savage crime than the poor wretch has committed. So let's break this all down. So essentially, there's this idea that whites, by nature of their position in society, are more evolved, and they are thus more equipped to survive. However, and they're much more equipped to enact harm against Black folks because of this idea of race preservation, right? It is in the idea of survival that they would harm Black men, right? But there is also this perception that Black men themselves would be willing to sacrifice their lives because they believe that having sex with white women and pursuing white women is a natural imperative that they must fulfill in order for their own race preservation, such that they would risk their own lives to make it happen, right? So again, this is a scientist who's saying this. This is someone who's a social Darwinist who is saying that it is not only in Black men's nature to behave hypersexually such that they would rape white women. It is their imperative because they want to elevate their race as a whole. And it for white men to defend themselves, that too is nature, by performing lynching and by performing that heinous act of lynching. Whew, I don't know about y'all, but that's a lot. The last quote I want to share comes from Carl von Linnaeus, who is, if had anybody in here who's any biology nerds who know him, knows that Carl von Linnaeus is the arbiter. He is the creator of the classification system, right? So he's the one that's responsible for us knowing mammals, amphibians, all those different reptiles, all those different classes of animals, right? He was the one who did all of that work. This is what he had to say about human beings, right? So Homo americanus, this refers to native folks, reddish, choleric, obstinate, contented, and regulated by custom. Homo europaeus, white, fickle, sanguine, blue-eyed, gentle, and governed by laws. Homo asiaticus, sallow, grave, dignified, avaricious, and ruled by opinion. And homo afer, black, phlegmatic, cunning, lazy, lustful, careless, and governed by caprice. So again, this was a scientist. This was someone who was uplifted in our society as being a leader in advancing intellectual knowledge about the human experience. And this is what he had to say about people. So early on, we see this inherent racialization, and particularly a racialization of everyone, but particularly this racialization of Black people around this notion of sexual depravity. Enraging, devastated, angry, yes. I'm just pointing out, and I thank you. I know folks are just kind of popping off. I get that. I want to focus again on the affect. Anger, re-traumatize. Yes, thank you for uplifting the idea of generational ancestral pain. Yes. Horrified. Yes. Yes. We're almost out of this. I want to take us into another activity. So Tuskegee, right? And I trust that everyone on this call has heard of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, or can do a quick Google and figure it out. What I'd like you to really quickly do, if you can take a breath, and inhale and exhale, so you can come back to this present moment. Grab another sheet of paper or use the paper that you had before. And I want you to get a pen, and I want you to do another brainstorm where you write down every single thing that you know about the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. And we're gonna, again, you'll have 1 minute to do that. So just take a minute and jot down whatever's coming to you that you know to be part of what the Tuskegee syphilis experiment was about. Take about 10 more seconds. Okay, so I want to uplift a comment that was raised in the chat, and kind of offer a spoiler connected to this, right? Someone talked about the struggle, the frustration of having these emotions and not being able to process it, right? Because I'm just kind of moving y'all through and just saying, name the emotion, name the emotion, name the emotion. I'd like you to consider what it's like for someone who lives this, who lives with this legacy, having to go about from day to day and having to not process these emotions because we don't have time. We have to uphold capitalism. We have to get this job done. We have to take care of the family. We have to uphold whiteness. We have to uphold all these other things, right? So while we're processing our own emotions and sitting with our own emotions, particularly, I recognize there are folks in this space who do identify as African American, and I want to honor that. But I also, particularly for the white folks in the room, I want you to sit with how for you, even just us talking about it has conjured up this affect for you. Imagine what it is like for someone who lives this and does not have the space, or is not given the space and the opportunity to properly process the affect that comes up from this. All right, so hopefully at this point you have a couple of things on your list related to Tuskegee. So we're just gonna go down some general facts, and then I wanna raise another point with you all. So yes, the Tuskegee syphilis study lasted 40 years, 1932 to 1972. And we know that it ended only because there was one white person who was willing to be a whistleblower on this, right? Which raises a whole other conversation that we're not going to get into today. Well, we might, in terms of thinking about, well, what can I do? We know that this is 40 years. We know that it studied the long-term effects of syphilis. This is a little bit different from folks who might have heard, oh, you know, men in Macon County, Macon County, Alabama, they were injected with syphilis. That's not what happened in this case. We do now have on record that in other cases outside of the United States, there were populations who were injected with syphilis. This is not one of those cases. The overarching thing, I know many of you might put down that we have an IRB now process for research because of what happened here. And a lot of folks talk about this idea of like ethics, right? The big takeaway that we could take away from syphilis is that ethics is a problem and we need to do better around research ethics. I also want you to consider that this was also a problem because it was a textbook case of anti-Blackness, right? And it beginning with the justification that this was a population that could be looked at because it was literally referred to in the literature as a syphilitic soaked race. So I want y'all to think about that, right, as well. So a couple more quotes I want to share with you just quickly. This one comes from Daniel Quillian, who was a doctor affiliated with the Tuskegee study. He was quoted as saying, virtue in the Negro race is like angels' visits, few and far between. He also talked about not knowing a virgin over the age of 14 in the Black community. This was his professional opinion about the folks that he served. And then last but not least is a quote from Dr. Thomas W. Morrell from the U.S. Public Health Service, again, the group responsible for the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. This is what he wrote in correspondence. He said, so the scourge sweeps among them. Those that are treated are only half cured, and the effort to assimilate a complex civilization drives their diseased minds until the results are criminal records. Perhaps here, in conjunction with tuberculosis, will be the end of the Negro problem. Disease will accomplish what man cannot do. And so again, thinking about anti-Blackness, it's not as simple as, it's not just a simple matter of, okay, we don't like Black people, right? Or Black people don't make as much money as white people, right? That's important. Those are significant issues, right? What I want us to see from this is the inherent ways that Black people and Blackness was attributed and thereby treated with the experience of genocide. This is what it boils down to. I've not yet included it in my own presentation, but if you do a quick Google search, I know within the last week, it has finally come out that North Carolina, right, a state that was, I mean, we know that forced sterilization was a common experience in the 1930s and 40s in poor and Black and brown populations, and it's still the case today in other populations, most notably incarcerated folks. However, it just came out in North Carolina within the last couple of weeks that that was intentional, right? And these are things that when you ask Black folks who've had those experiences, they'll tell you, yeah, we believe it's intentional. We know it's intentional, right? So this is not a surprise to Black folks. However, it's important to understand that it's not just some happy accident or some unfortunate accident that these things have occurred. They're systemic and they are actively about adversely affecting the livelihood and by extension, the sexual health and expression of Black and brown people. So here's where I want to kind of shake it off just a little bit. If you haven't had a chance to yet, maybe just shake off some of that energy, again, do some more deep breaths. These are two questions I'd like us to kind of bookmark or kind of put a midpoint in. We're going to bring in a couple more pieces, but just a little bit right here to think about. is anti-Blackness still an issue in the 21st century human sexuality discourse? And if so, what legacy has it left for contemporary sexual health practitioners, right? These are questions that sat with me when I first started to do this research, right? Because I'm of the mindset that history matters, and that we also need to be clear about what is history's relationship to the present, right? I think we can often make assumptions that, oh, well, because this happened, this automatically happens, right? And that's not always the case. We also recognize that oppressed people of all walks of life can experience great resilience despite what has happened to them, right? So I want to acknowledge that. And also the question for me when I first started doing this research doing this work was figuring out, well, what is the legacy? Like what effect has this, what has this looked like in terms of people's real-time experiences? And so that's where we get into my research. So I'm just going to share a little bit of that here. My research is an attempt to kind of understand what has that racialized history look like in the contemporary experiences of Black and Brown people. And so I'm not going to go through this too far, but I did a grounded theory study, and I'm going to share with you some of the things that people said. This is the overarching theory. There's more to it that I'm not going to get into, but the specific pieces I am going to talk about are a piece of exuded being, referred to, the term is coined by E. Patrick Johnson, but I refer to his work here, performative Blackness, as well as external influence, and specifically the idea of racial maligning being an adverse experience to an individual's healthy sexual expression. So I'll talk about that now. And so I want to really clearly acknowledge that when I talk to people, these were all qualitative interviews. And when I talk to them, I specifically asked them to talk about what sexiness looked like to them. As I mentioned earlier, we tend to, when doing research with Black and Brown community, but with Black communities, it tends to be very much, tell me about HIV, or tell me about your condom usage, tell me about these things. And I wanted to have more of a developmental type of conversation where we did something that wasn't negative. And so I said, tell me what sexiness looks like to you. And then I also asked people to let me know whether or not they believe that being Black affected the way they experienced and thought about sexuality. I'm starting with the adverse things that people said, because the vast majority of people who, when I asked them that question, they said that it affected them negatively, that being Black affected their sexuality in a negative way. And it became such a consistent pattern, such that I then started to point it out to people. And I asked, well, I notice everything you've said is negative. Is there anything that you would deem to be positive? One person, in fact, told me no, that she could not, in fact, think of anything positive. So that's why we're starting here. Not to say there isn't positive things, we're going to get to those, but I want to start here. And so this is a quote that's offered by Ashton, who was a queer femme living in Baltimore. And she talked about kind of the influence of race as being this box, right? And so she says, I think the box is just the man, the woman. It is the man going to work. It is the man providing for the family. It is the woman at home, cooking, cleaning, maintaining life. It is just man, woman. You have your 2 kids, you guys go to church. It is just that typical, family. You have your 2 kids. I'm sorry, it is what it is. They put us in a box. It is what it's supposed to look like. And if it's not that, no one understands it. What is that? How is that? How can you be managed? You know what I mean? Questions come about if you look like anything outside of the box. And so I think this is significant, particularly if you're familiar with any conversations around respectability politics, right? And the ways that Black people have had to regulate or self-censor or police themselves and each other with respect to perceiving themselves or advancing themselves as being respectable by predominant white culture. That this is connected and that this is where this comes from. People also talked about things like colorism, right? So this was Crystal in Chicago, who talked about her experience. And she said, you kind of feel like you're definitely aware that you are different. You're not like the other girls. You're not blonde haired. You're not blue eyed. You're not light skinned. That influenced my perception of myself, because growing up, you kind of knew the dudes in your neighborhood went for a very specific type of girl. And that, hasn't really changed much within the last 30 years. So you always sort of feel like you're not the ideal. And that's reinforced by everything you see. Every piece of media you see reinforces that idea. People talked about fetishization, right? King, who was a genderqueer person in Ohio, talked about looking past race, that while they were in relationships with non-Black people looking past race, those other folks were enamored with her race in a way that they thought they weren't doing, right? And so thinking about the parallels to what we brought up in the quotes about people being infatuated with Black bodies, right? They were enamored with them. Aaron, who was a genderqueer person, talked about dating white girls because they could, right? Because they knew they could always get a white girl willing to be in a relationship with them. So there was kind of this dual fetishization that was going on. Lola talked about always being a social experiment. In addition, people experience stereotyping. Again, Kui talked about having this experience of people telling her that Black people with vaginas have better vaginas, right? Internally, though, there's also this experience that I apologize at this moment, I can't remember who said it, but someone talked about being threatened by Black male sexuality, right? And so having internalized the messages they have been taught about Black men, right? And as a result, having to work through this fear that they have been taught about Black men and their sexuality. Race-based double standards. Ashton, who I referred to earlier, talked about working in a job environment where expectations were made differently of her than those made of her white counterparts, particularly related to the dress code. Right, so she discussed being able to see her white female colleagues wear things that wouldn't, and maybe even having similar to close body size, where they wouldn't be policed. But then if it's something that she wore, she was, being written up, she was being called in for correction, those sorts of things. And then marginalization, right? King again talked about that they weren't good enough to date, but they were good enough to have sex with. Right, and the exact language she uses is good enough to fuck, right? So those are experiences that people talked about in terms of their interpersonal experiences. But there's a couple of larger ones that I think are also important for us to think about as practitioners. Ginger D in Delaware talked about, in our culture, we more so hide family issues and problems as to not out a perpetrator. So incest and rape, in many instances, I feel like in many ways too, because Black women are over-sexualized, when we become victims of rape, we're asked, we're blamed, and made to take the onus for someone victimizing us. And so there's two different pieces in here that I think are important, right? There's the piece of needing to protect the perpetrator, right? And often that is when we say, well, protect from what? It is protect from from unjust racial systems, right? Unjust treatment by the law, unjust treatment by white culture. And there's also the victimization, right? And the being made to hold the onus for one's own experience, right? So there's two pieces, and it all kind of comes under this umbrella of community concealment, this idea of we don't air our dirty laundry. And connected to that is the experience of self-concealment. So Alex in New York talks about having to overcome a lot of things and being raised in a household where you just didn't talk about sex. And specifically, he says, it's something you do in the dark. It's something that you don't talk about. It's just not done. Like I said, though, not everything was negative. And so I want to really quickly highlight some of the pieces that people were able to express about sexuality and their identity that were sources of affirmation for them, were sources of empowerment for them. And so lots of people talked about there being nothing like a Black man, right? We did have one person who also talked about Black women being able to walk in a room and not being swallowed up by anybody, right? But this idea of being able to own one's race and be comfortable in their skin, like this is a source of sexiness. This is a source of empowerment and sexual health, if you will, to be able to own all of who you are, including your big lips, your big nose, your big everything else, your dark skin, your nappy hair, et cetera, et cetera. Elizabeth talked about, in so many ways, it feels very empowering to me, you know, my Blackness and my sexual identity and my sexiness. When I thought about Blackness and my Blackness and how it related to my sexiness, it just felt like this inherent kind of thing now, like Blackness is sexy. And then Alex again simply says, sexiness manifests through the Black experience. Two other pieces that again are about the ways that folks use their Blackness and their identity to assert their confidence, and by extension, I'll get to why in a second, their sexual health. Jewel talks about the persons that she's attracted to, and she says, tall and curvy are what I like, but I also think that this is part of this radicalization that continues to happen as I get older, which is that it's not what society says sexiness is to be that reverberates in my life, in the sense of the deprogramming of myself and really being an actor in white supremacy and anti-Blackness. So again, there's health, there's affirmation that's gained by actively divesting from ideas about how you should be as a sexual Black person, that those ways that are rooted in white supremacist thinking, that are rooted in anti-Blackness. And the same for Leslie, right? She says, I think someone can be sexy without being conventionally attractive. I can still be sexy, even if there are people who may not think that I am pretty. And so I think when sharing my work, it may be a little bit easier, and I'm going to wrap up very soon so we can get into conversation, but I think it can be kind of easy to kind of look at those pieces as fluff, as kind of like, oh, well, that's sexuality. That doesn't necessarily relate to sexual health. However, I want us to think about what we know about the relationship between sexual self-esteem and sexual agency and sexual health outcomes, recognizing that it matters to be able to have self-possession in terms of your willingness to be able to assert what you want sexually, if that includes practicing safe sex measures, if that includes or not, right? Recognizing that having that sense of agency to be able to make the choices that you deem to be best for you is directly connected to long-term sexual health outcomes. And so the implications that I really hope folks get is that race matters, and not just in terms of what a Black person gets access to in the way of sexual health services or not, but in terms of how they're treated, how they might see themselves, and how they're treated in terms of how they're conceptualized. And that this is both conscious and unconscious, right? Often a lot of these things, a lot of these experiences may be happening where a person's not even aware of what they're experiencing. They just know something doesn't feel right. I went into this office and this person, or I went into this class and this person was saying something and it just didn't sit well with me, right? They're not aware that that's what's happening when it in fact is happening. And so for those who do research in sexual health practice, it's important to understand that sexuality and sexual health is much bigger than just what you're doing with what's between your legs. And that again, race is much bigger than social indicators, right? It's directly related to the quality of sexual health, both in the immediate and long term. And so here's some recommendations. I'm going to try to keep them brief. I think the first one is being willing to call a thing. I think, fortunately, within the last few months, we've kind of seen this surge of folks being willing to call out racism and to use terms like white supremacy and be able to say these things, and anti-Blackness. I think we need to do more of that, right? Being able to see and call a thing what it is, being able to say, no, this is not right. And these are the specific things, this is the specific ways that that's showing up. And I know that it's not just white supremacy and anti-Blackness, it's all its derivatives, right? So recognizing, like, if you saw the quote about the box, right? There were some implications, some assumptions there, not just about race, but also about sexual orientation, also about relationship status, also about parenting status, all of those things. And so I think the next piece we also have to do is be able to deconstruct and divest from those things. When we establish what we deem to be ideal sexual health, we need to recognize that far too often that's rooted in ideals that don't serve the vast majority of people or don't represent their real-time lived experience. And so we have to be willing to call those things out and actively work to divest from them, such that even if, say, a client that we're working with is quote unquote making a mistake, reserving our judgment to avoid attempting to shame them, to avoid attempting to move them out of a place of being the agency and the arbiter for their own sexual health and their own life. And then last but not least, we have to start doing different things, right? We can't just tear stuff down and that's the end. We have to start doing different things, right? And so as shown from the picture here that I'm sharing, that includes bringing in more marginalized voices, right? Voices from the community, and not just frontline folks, but having them come into positions of power and being able to speak to the work that should be done and speak to the way in which the work is carried out. But we also, how we do that work has to be done differently. So centering healing over health, right? Before I did this job, I was before I did what before I got in front of you all, I used to be a health resource center coordinator, which was a fancy word for the condom lady. And it boggled my mind the number of time, like the emphasis on condom distribution, right? This idea that we have to get this number of condoms out and we have to get that folks are picking these up. And it's like, okay, but what is their quality of life, right? Like what is their lived experience, right? Not, are they using these condoms? What is their relationship to their sexual health? What is their relationship to their sexuality? And how can I be supporting that, right? That also means we move from detriment to development, right? It's not enough to just say, oh, okay, this person is adhering to their meds on a regular basis. We have to, what else in their lives also needs support and also needs growth? We need to move out of detriment to development. And we have to recognize that this requires us to make decisions that aren't deemed the most up and up, right? So, and that means we have to seek forgiveness, not permission. If we acknowledge that the systems and structures that are in place have been actively working against African-American people, then sometimes that means we have to do things that may not line up with what they perceive to be that should be done. And we have to be willing to seek forgiveness and not permission, where we can show that, hey, the community is better for this, not what you think that you want to fund or what you think you should happen. This is what the community says they need, and this is how they're showing they are better off because of this. And then we need to balance the work and then compensate for it. So yes, again, bringing in folks from marginalized populations, and we need to properly compensate them for doing that work. Not just, okay, I've got this extra piece here so you can come and be a facilitator, or you can come again, be someone on the front line. I want to properly give you a livable wage. I want to properly give you the hours. I want to properly give you the experience that you can take with you to wherever you're going, so you can effectively do the work well in a way that sustains your quality of life. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop, just because we have time. We want to get some discussion going. I do have some recommendations. Yes, and with benefits. I see that in the chat. It shouldn't be that the only folks at the top have basic things like healthcare, right? There are some other pieces that I want to wrap up with, but I want to really quickly go to the questions and see if there are any that I can help respond to. Actually, there's only 2 here, so I might just quickly answer these and get back into my recommendations. A question someone asked was, how do we address health disparities in the Black community without linking Black people to death? So again, we have to move out of prevention, right? And this is uncomfortable for people, because I think we perceive that if a person is not dealing, or we've been taught that if a person is not dealing with insert whatever disease or whatever that we've determined is a problem, or what situation we've determined is a problem, that counts as health. And recognizing that may not in fact qualify as health or count as health, particularly if you're dealing with communities that have a whole host of other things going on for them. So for example, I grew up, so a lot of this work comes from my own, I consider myself a member of my constituency, right? I grew up in the 90s in an area of the country that was, you know, the worst, maybe like 2 years in a row. We had the highest teen pregnancy rates in the country. And so I was deemed at risk, right? That was the whole thing. We're going to save Black kids. We're going to save Black girls. And you know, I had all of these initiatives, right? And the assumption was that if I did not have a baby when I was in my teens, that life would be good. I'd be okay. I'd be able to graduate. If I graduate from high school with no baby and I graduate from college with no baby, all good, right? Nobody talks about the fact that, okay, Black women still, you know, have to deal with disproportionate access to the market, right? That they still have to deal with being relegated to pink and blue and pink collar jobs, right? That they are more often likely to have to deal with the effects of parent morbidity, right? Like the idea that the older I get, the harder it would even be able to have access, and then I might not even survive if I got pregnant, right? None of that was ever factored in when thinking about, oh, we just need to stop you from having a baby right now, right? And so the question becomes, where's the health? Was that really about health? Was that really about my wellness, right? And so we have to start, in order to really address disparities, we have to redefine what disparity means. And recognize that the things that we assume to be a disparity may not in fact represent disparity or represent the most significant, important disparity for the folks who it affects. And again, it's a tough answer because we like to believe that, oh, no, the problem is these babies, and the problem is this HIV, and the problem is this, and it's like, actually, we could have none of those, and there would still be issues in the Black community that are going consistently unaddressed. They have nothing to do with individual behaviors that are occurring in the community. There is a question here about interracial dating. Just because it's a little bit outside of the scope of this presentation, I'm going to hold off on it and see how much more I can get through, but I do want to acknowledge that it was asked. Let me quickly go back and get through the rest of my presentation. So I always have folks who are like, okay, this is all great. So what do I do? What can I do? What can I do? So there are 6 questions. I guess you can call them homework questions, if you will, that I'll share with you all right now, that hope maybe they can spark something for you, hopefully. So this is a question, and they're questions that can be directed to clients, that can be questions that you ask yourself, that can be that you ask your staff of color, whoever that you would deem a stakeholder in the work. So for everyone, I would encourage you at your organization, for everyone at your organization, to ask and answer, how does race, all of these things, right? So race, racism, white supremacy, anti-Blackness, all of the derivatives that I talked about earlier, how do they influence sexuality for the people that you serve? And be willing to be honest about that, right? Because often, and honest, even acknowledging that you may not know the answer and that you may need to invite other folks who can answer that question. Just because you can't answer the question doesn't mean that there's no effect. So inviting people to help answer the questions, right? As well, asking, how are we missing the boat on serving Black and brown people, right? So asking everyone that, again, all of your stakeholders. For your clients, for your students, for whoever you're in front of in your class, the service provision, asking, and you have to tailor the question to fit your audience, right? Like it doesn't have to look exactly like what I'm saying right here, but asking folks, what in your estimation would real life transformative service provision look like, right? So maybe it is a condom. Maybe it's all I need is a condom. All I need are is my long acting reversible contraceptive. Maybe that's all I need. But in fact, there may be more things that would actually be more effective if you just ask the question and find out. It may be, actually, I would like a space to explore my hangups around masculinity. right? I'd like to explore, you know, have a space to explore my queer attractions that that I can't do in my community, or I can't do when I'm at home, right? Like, we don't know unless we ask the question. For staff of color, particularly Black staff, asking, what do you need to feel more encouraged by the work that we do? And what things have I and or senior management been doing to keep that from happening? Again, these are questions that we often don't want to ask because they require us to do some deep, serious work and some honest self-reflection, right? But only through that honesty, that uprooting all of the ickiness that has kind of rooted, or that's formed the foundation of what this field is. Only through uprooting that can we get to a place of peace and being able to establish new seeds that are rooted in wellness, that are rooted in thriving and not detriment. And then last but not least, for yourself, particularly if you are a leader in your organization, right? And I acknowledge that this is predominantly for white folks, but particularly if you are a Black person or a person of color in a leadership position, but you also have privilege maybe around your gender identity or your sexual orientation, having a conversation with yourself around how well are we serving, or how well are you serving other folks within the Black community, around this work, right? And asking, what am I willing to give up in order to make this work more equitable and divested from unjust systems? No, this is a question that you, if you're serious about doing the work to divest, this is a question that you want to answer with an accountability team. So when you say, yes, I'm willing to actively work with Black trans women in the community to get more resources to provide education there, right? Having someone who will hold you to that. All right. So these are also two questions that I want to share with you all that'll hopefully frame the next 15 minutes of our discussion together. Thinking about what opportunities or ethical responsibility do we have in addressing anti-Blackness in the work that we do? And then what are the ramifications of not doing this work? So if we just said, oh, that was a cute presentation, that was cool, you know, I know it was a little uncomfortable, she got me all in my feelings, but you know, that was cute. What's the ramifications of just leaving this here? Right? Think through that. So with that, I do have some readings here. If you want to screenshot them real quickly, you can do that. I also, I believe, Dr. Reader, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I believe I can probably give you all this in a handout later, but if you want to real quick take a screenshot of the works that I've been using, this is slide 1. This is slide 2. And there's one more slide in just a second. And this is slide 3. And with that, I am done and ready to chat. Here's my information. If you would like it again, please take it. Feel free to reach out to me, and I'm happy to have more conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Gilbert, for your presentation. I must admit there were moments where I began to feel uncomfortable and I needed to take a deep breath for myself just to regather my thoughts and recognize these are my emotions and understanding where it was coming from. And so I thank you for allowing us to chat in the chat box and express our feelings. And I did see the kind of statement that it's hard to kind of address or name the feelings when we don't have a place to discuss them. And I thought to myself, you know what? Unfortunately, because of Corona, we're unable to be in person to do a training in person to be able to have that access. However, with webinars, this is what kind of we have to do to be able to have some difficult conversations in a way that we can still try to engage the audience. And so I thank you for your transparency. I thank you for using historical references to help us connect the dots to our own narratives that uphold anti-Blackness in our work even as a Black woman, in our own identity that stems from kind of generational messaging that we've learned over the time. And I'm also appreciative of how you also pose questions to help our non-Black people, our white co-workers or people who we work with, to also think about how they are also upholding some of these narratives and providing care to communities of color. So thank you for your expertise. So we do have some questions that has popped up.
Yes.
I'm sure you can see them as well.
Yes. So I will be, a couple of folks have asked about slides. I will say I do not typically share slides just because the amount of intellectual labor that I put into making them, I try to keep those close to me, just because they're also teaching slides, so I don't share them in that for that way. That said, I'm happy to share the readings that folks can read, and they can continue to reflect in their own and develop their own, you know, kind of organic thoughts and ideas around them. And I'm happy, you know, folks can hire me, and I'm happy to come and present the slides to their groups as well. Let's see. There was a question. Yes, right. So a great question around how we deal with funders and curricula that have to be done with fidelity. I'm very clear, and I'm very clear that this is, to me, in my mind, this is one of the major challenges of our field, that we have curricula, that we have interventions that are dependent, that are funding dependent on doing them in a way that perpetuates anti-Blackness, right? Again, I believe that that requires us, if we are serious about doing the radical work of divesting and shifting, I believe that requires us to make decisions that necessitate forgiveness instead of permission. What that will look like for every organization will be different. I know for myself, I do not do, and I will never do evidence-based interventions, because I know the vast majority of them are rooted in anti-Black ideals. So that's a tough question. But I put it back, and it becomes a matter of, okay, so what am I willing to give up, right? What am I willing to risk in order to see that the community I serve has what they need and not what I'm being paid to offer them? So I'm going to leave that there. Writings about reparations work. I'm not quite sure what this question is referring to. I believe it might be about alternative ways. Correct me if I'm wrong, but a question around alternative ways of kind of doing this work. I will acknowledge there's not a lot of folks who are offering alternative ways that I'm familiar with. I have another workshop that I do that looks at African-centered epistemologies and ways that can be used to think about sex education differently. Coincidentally, though, I think a large problem in our field is that Eurocentric ideas have kind of had the monopoly over how this work is done, such that people perceive themselves to being in different camps, whether, oh, you know, we're comprehensive, or, oh, we're abstinence only, without having dealt with the anti-Blackness that undergirds both of them. And so just in terms of just some rough strategies, I definitely think being more trauma informed in the work that we do, specifically around racial trauma, is a great way to begin doing some of that work. But yeah, I don't know of folks who are actually doing readings around that. Again, I'm happy to consult with folks if you want to have conversations offline about that. But yeah, I think it's not, people are not they're not asking the questions as well as I think could be happening if we were willing to see the challenges there. There's a question, really great questions here. Yes. So resources that you would recommend for Black people who want to see racism addressed in the health work they do, but do not feel that addressing administration can be done in a way that feels safe. Ooh, great question. So Whew. Let's see. I'm thinking. Yeah, see, I'm trying to think of actual works that come to mind. Honestly, I think the real conversations, many of the conversations I've seen of what people are doing are happening online, are happening off, like they're happening in non-traditional spaces, meaning they're not producing journal articles about it. They're not kind of writing curricula in the formal sense of it. They're doing their work in the community, or they are working independently. However, that said, if you would be willing, whoever wrote that question, because it says anonymous, if you would be willing to email that to me directly, I would be willing to put in some more research, because I also acknowledge that I don't know that I fully have the answer to that question. So if you would send that question, whoever wrote it, about wanting resources for Black people who want to see racism addressed and are looking for how to do that, that feels safe, if you could email that to me, I'm willing to do some more research and touch bases with my colleagues and see if I can help you with that. So there's that. Yes, the history of social work is also absolutely rooted in anti-Blackness. The vast majority of fields that were founded in this country were about solving the Negro problem. Well, solving problems, but most predominantly the Negro problem. And so as such, they are rooted in anti-Blackness. Thinking about how white people take up space in social work communities, and how, if we are taking up space in that work, there can be givebacks. Ooh, I mean, I think so. I think that has to be done on a more interpersonal level. I don't know that there's any major project that I'm aware of that can be done that really kind of addresses that kind of on a blanket level. But I think in our regular encounters, being in constant communication with colleagues is so important. Just being in, like, when things happen, having conversations with Black colleagues, not in a way that centers your feelings or centers your desires, but says, hey, I am here, I am present and available if there is ever a time that you might need me, right? Or might need support for whatever is happening, or encouragement, or whatever it is that you're going through. I think far too often, and I think what was experienced in June, right, was there's this whole groundswell, and white people like all of a sudden getting in people's DMs and, oh, I'm so sorry, and oh, you know, these things. And it was like, well, one, where were you prior when all this, like, this isn't the first time this has happened, but also, is this about me or is this about you, right? So if you are wanting to be in someone's space because you are feeling guilty, that's very different than, I genuinely care for you and I want to be a support, right? One of the best things someone said to me during that time was, listen, you don't have to respond. I just want you to know that I thank you for existing. Something as simple as that, right? Just really showing that you understand the burden that it takes to be in these bodies and to have this lived experience at this particular time can go a long way. Sometimes it could also just be, hey, here's $5. Go get yourself some Starbucks because you the bomb, right? Like but everybody will be different in terms of the folks that you are in community with, right? And so, but that's also about recognizing humanity and getting to know people as humans and not just the Black person that you work with, right? Because one Black person is gonna want that Cash App drop, right? One person is gonna enjoy, just stay out my face, don't talk to me at all, right? Get to know people individually and not just the Black people that you feel the need to what's the word, to perform allyship for, right? I see you, Javante, in the comments dropping your Cash Apps. Black folks, if y'all want to drop your Cash Apps, feel free. I'm not condoning it. Well, I am condoning it. I'm always condoning it. But, you know, look. Yes. Somebody, oh, yeah, that is it. I want to just honor the question that was raised just now. Someone is raising the question of how this can be addressed at a federal level. And I want to honor it because I don't know that there's answers. I'm going to be very transparent. I don't know that there's answers. What I will say is I do think it's very important for folks like us to be in communication or to be aware of what's happening in the government at the policy level, right? So real quick, I want to uplift YAS and the REA and the YAS acts, which are two acts that are currently that have been advanced in Congress now related to sex education and sexual health services for young people. For folks who are wanting to figure out, like, how can we move things, right? Supporting legislation that is really about empowering communities. And in this case, it's about empowering young people to have accurate, medically accurate, culturally sensitive sexual health information, as well as access to sexual health services fair and across the board, right? Supporting those sorts of things, I think, is very important. I think often we may kind of be like, well, politics, that's not my jam. But there are things that are happening, and there are moves that are happening, at least by the minority. And so being in touch with that, following SYPHILIS, for example, and seeing what they're doing to help elevate those conversations, I think can be very important. I'm not just going to tell you just a blanket vote, because that's a whole other conversation, but just being in communication with those sorts of things and being aware and ready to move on those sorts of things, I think can be a small answer to that. Did you see, Dr. Rita, there was a question someone was asking for my email address?
Yes, so if you were done questions, I was going to ask if you can put your slide up of your contact information so they can write down your email.
Yes. Ooh, excuse me. So I will share that one more time for folks who need it. Oh, and the act names, I'll just type it. So the RHEA, I believe it's RHEYA, and YAS it's RHEYA, Real Health Education Youth Act, and YAS, which is Youth Access to Sexual Health Services Act. Those are definitely conversations to be paying attention to and following as much as possible. All right, so I don't see any more questions here that I have not answered. So I think at 129.
That's awesome. And so again, Dr. Gilbert, I thank you and I appreciate you for taking the time out to share your knowledge with us all. And I'm hoping that Blacks and whites have been enlightened, but we're walking away with some things to chew on, to really think about how can we be a change agent to affect change with the topic of anti-Blackness and systemic racism, to promote healing within our work, within ourselves, with also in our community. So thank you so much, Dr. Gilbert. For those of you watching, don't forget to hang on tight. You'll be prompted to complete a survey to give your thoughts about today's presentation. Dr. Gilbert, do you have any last words before we close out?
None at all. Thank you so much. Oh, yes. Wash your hands, wear a mask, please. And thank you. Stay in the house.
All right, everyone. Have a great afternoon. And also this Friday, we're also having our second webinar presentation. Look on our website, register for part 2 of, well, the second webinar to our anti-Blackness healing through restorative dialogue. Have a great day. Bye.